let's start. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the MEDAERE session on transboundary water cooperation in the Mediterranean and the EU, framing common policies for common resources. That's the title of today's session. I must admit that I'm a bit exhausted by now, to be honest, so you will excuse me if I go wrong from time to time, and you will help me with your interventions. But I'm super happy to have such a great panel today to discuss this topic. As the title says, we want to look into transboundary water issues and water cooperation in the Mediterranean under the MEDAERE newly born association that keeps organizing events. Somehow it keeps going on its own now because I start launching the idea I'm proposing, but now more ideas and more requests are coming, which is the best I could really ask for. This is also because the problems are numerous, and this is not good. But we have common problems in the Mediterranean, and the first thing probably that comes to your mind is water, or one of the first for sure. Water scarcity, water pollution, but also unequal distribution and cross-border tensions because of water. At the same time, we have common aspects, but very different aspects, like demographic trends that are very different in the Mediterranean, or hydrological diversity. So we have that common water pool called Mediterranean, but then we also have different water issues in different regions. So we want to try and address these differences and similarities in this session, looking at the possible nature-based solution, technology solution, policy solutions that can exist. In one question, the ultimate question we want to address is how can Mediterranean and EU transboundary water governance evolve to address climate-induced water stress, ecological degradation, and socio-political instability. All in all, this is the big question. But I will try to ask specific questions to each of the panelists. And I will start with the first panelist who is online. I have to add, unfortunately, because Anastasios, I was waiting for you here. I have no one to discuss basket with, you know, that's very bad. You all know Anastasios Xepapadeas, but still, let me introduce him. As you know, he is professor of economics, professor emeritus, I should say, at Athens University of Economics and Business. I think you are still professor of economics at the University of Bologna, right?
Yes, I am.
He's a member of the US National Academy of Sciences. He's past president of EAERE, co-editor of Environmental Resource Economics, and in the editorial board of the Annual Review of Resource Economics. Over 150 articles, over 35 research projects, over and over again. So I will stop here. You probably also know the topics because you must have read his papers on uncertainty, spatial dynamics, climate economics, and so on and so forth. So why are you here talking about water, Tassos? Because I want to know your opinion on how economic modeling can help rethink transboundary water governance in the Mediterranean under climate uncertainty and regional inequalities. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simone. It's great to be even remotely among friends. Hello, everybody. I see very known faces there. Wish I was there, but I will try to do my best by presenting remotely. So let me share my what happens to my okay. Can you see?
Yes,
can you see my screen?
Yes.
Is it okay? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, yeah.
Good. Okay. So the idea is to answer to Simone's questions, and the first idea is how can economic modeling help rethink transboundary water governance in the Mediterranean under climate uncertainty and regional inequalities. And then there's a second question about policy instruments, which I guess we'll discuss it in the second round. So what I will try to do in the next few minutes is to try to describe the ingredients that I believe that a general model should have in order to study these issues. And I mean, the ingredients have been used in different ways in different types of models. I mean, there's lots of work done here, and people in the room have done a lot of work in these issues. So this could be my idea of trying to describe what I think the ingredients of such an economic model should be, and how these ingredients could be somehow homogenized and developed into a model, a coherent model that can provide some insight, especially about policy design. Let's start with regional characteristics, because we need to understand regional inequalities. We want to introduce regional inequalities, and in a way to break from the assumption of symmetry that us economists use a lot when we try to develop models with lots of agents. Symmetry is a very convenient assumption, but most of the times it's not very appropriate in real world situations. So first, the idea is to define regional benefit function that depend on the water use. And this benefit function could be quite general, could be straightforward benefits from agriculture, but could also be benefits from ecosystem services, from watersheds. Could be the benefit function could be as general as we can do it given the structure of the problem. The second is to describe water dynamics in each region. Here we need to describe inflows, outflows, and we'll come to that later, the way that these dynamics will be affected by climate change. I think an important characteristic of these problems is that since we're discussing a problem that has many users, different regions, but at the same time, many sources, okay, because there will be different water sources in different regions, we need to try and understand the interrelations between the regional water sources. So we need a spatial structure into the model, and I'm thinking of trying to understand it as a spatial network, okay, which could be either directed if we try to understand upstream, downstream problems where the direction, there's a specific direction, but could also be undirected type of networks if different water resources might be interconnected. And here we can use Darcy's law that might describe the way that different types, that the way that water is transported, especially in underwater, in underground aquifers. Then we can define the cost structure for each regional users, which could be, in a simple case, extraction costs related to the way that the water is extracted, but there might be also potential effects from distance, water losses, and also congestion effects if we have many users using the same source at the same time, in which case we might have different types of congestion effects. So finally, the idea would be to build a model with multiple regional users extracting water from multiple interconnected regional sources. This could be the model. Now, when we start developing net benefit functions, benefits and cost of extraction, eventually we will induce a preference ordering among water sources. So each regional user should have some kind of preference ordering given the potential water sources that this user might be able to use. So regional inequalities will be captured by the difference in cost and benefits, the difference in the capacity of the water volume of each source. Some regions might have plenty of resources, some regions might have less water resources, and especially the type of water flow on our network. So in a sense, if you want, this is how I see an economic model that will somehow incorporate these regional inequalities into a water management problem. Then we come to climate change. We know, I won't spend much time there, but we know that climate change affects the replenishment of water sources, and we also know that the Mediterranean is a hot spot, and then we might have important impacts from climate change on our water sources. Now, we want to make the evolution of the water stock, consider it as an abstract resource management problem. We want to make the evolution of the stock dependent on climate change. Now, my feeling and I would say, where I think it's better to model it, is to consider that the evolution of climate change, either in terms of temperature or precipitation, is kind of exogenous for the Mediterranean region. This is because the regions in the Mediterranean, especially if you go to the North Africa part of the Mediterranean, are not any significant emitters. I mean, these days, the European Union is now the fifth among the big five. India emits more than the European Union as a whole. So I think that one could try, in a modeling exercise, will try to take the IPC scenarios, scale them down to the Mediterranean region. This is important because here we have an important physical problem in terms of climate change. We need to scale down the IPC general scenarios to the Mediterranean region, and so that we will have, I'm thinking of a function of water inflow into each potential water source in the Mediterranean region to be function of the forward paths of IPCC in terms of climate change, properly scaled down to the Mediterranean level. Uncertainty. Well, uncertainty is a big issue here, and one can start incorporating uncertainty at different levels. Typically, one could introduce uncertainty to water dynamic by considering stochastic talk processes. This is a standard way of doing these things. In this case, the water stock is affected by the increments of a Wiener process. But when we put into the model climate change, we need now to start thinking about more complex dynamics. We try to start thinking about catastrophic shocks, posing tipping points. So in a sense, I think that in order to capture this part, which must be probably the most important part of the whole thing, I think one should introduce in the dynamics also Poisson arrivals that and hazard rates that will somehow try to understand the way that shocks in the water system might be generated by climate change. Once we go through this level of uncertainty, which actually is not uncertainty, it's risk, we can go a little bit further and we can go to deep uncertainty or Knightian uncertainty. I saw in the audience Katarina. We used to work on these things long time ago. So we now could enter in a world where we don't know probabilities, where the Wiener process or the Poisson process are distorted, and then we're in a world of multipliers that live in an entropy ball, and then we don't know which one eventually we might get. We might be averse to ambiguity, Okay, in this situation, we are averse to ambiguity. We prefer known risks. We prefer known risks relative to unknown risks. And of course, we might have concerns about modeling specification because we might get probability measures that live inside the center of the ball and are very different from the model we have considered as our benchmark model. These problems can be solved these days. I mean, there's robust control methods that have been used. I've used them. But these also days, there's work by that group of last Hansen group in Chicago that they have started developing better ways to deal with smooth ambiguity methods. So one could start discussing these things. So one could see risk and uncertainty on different levels, started from I would say, simple Brownian motions and moving to Poisson arrivals, moving to ambiguity and robust control and smooth ambiguity measures. Finally, once we have this kind of a model, we need to ask ourselves, okay, we have a model and we'll try to solve it. What kind of a solution we are seeking? I mean, what's the solution concept that might be relevant for what we're trying to do? So in this type of analysis, two major types of solutions have emerged. Cooperative solution, in which regions cooperatively decide about extraction path by maximizing global benefits, subject to all dynamics and all the constraints of the problem. I think this is what Simone was hinting in his introduction. But we also have non-cooperative solution, which in the cases which regions maximize discounted benefits subject to all the constraints, but own benefits, and then consider the response of other regions. The two strong type of solutions in this kind of context is solutions leading to an open nucleus equilibrium, in where each region will be committed to an extraction path from the outset of the game and will stay on that committed path. And we might have feedbacks in equilibria, which are extraction strategies which depend on the stock. Now, the structure of the problem, the asymmetries, the different type of uncertainty, the special temporal structure provide important challenges to solving of these kind of problems. So it is important to try and understand that solving these problems, it's not straightforward. So what I described here is also areas of further research problems that have been solved yet and in the process of solving. And finally, one might consider that in these non-cooperative solutions, we might have different levels of myopia associated with the regions. Some regions might not take into account dynamics, might not take into account risk, no uncertainty, and so on. And these different types of myopia will differentiate a lot the non-cooperative solutions from the cooperative solutions, which will take us to the policy type of discussion, which I will leave it for later. So I will stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tassos. Listening to your intervention, I was thinking about my students. I think students should be exposed to how a model emerges. Because here, there was already the structure of a model. You just needed to transform this into equations. And I was taking notes on how this could be done. But we will discuss this.
I have lots of equations. The equation more or less exist.
But really interesting and fascinating, particularly the aspect when you mentioned the fact that temperature is an exogenous variable for Mediterranean countries, too small to affect it. And so we could model it as an exogenous variable. But let's come back to our panel and to our second panelist, Katarina. Katarina Roseta-Palma is Associate Professor of Economics at the ISCTE, Istituto Universitário de Lisboa, former Director of Sustainability until 2022. Her research focuses on water resource management and environmental policy. She has advised the Portuguese Environment Ministry, the European Commission, and various regional water authorities. She was EAERE Council member, Vice President in 2013, and she was part of the 2014 Green Tax Reform Commission in Portugal. And she keeps engaging in both academic but also applied work. So, Katarina, my question to you to start with is the following. How can national water management align more effectively with regional cooperation goals in the Mediterranean? And what are the barriers, institutional, economic barriers, that prevent this?
Okay. So I maybe will stand. Can I change the slide? Or somebody else touch it? So first of all, I wanted to begin by thanking you all, and especially Tassos. I don't know, where is Tassos? Are you there? If I do, are you looking?
You can see. Yeah.
I really wanted you to be here, Tassos, because I haven't seen you in a long time in person.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And this man taught me a lot. He was the first person who, other than my wonderful supervisor, who was also sitting in the room, PhD supervisor, that was a long time ago, but he was the first person to take me seriously as a modeler, and he taught me a lot as a modeler, and so I really wanted to thank you. And because you're not here and I can't do this during the break, I'm doing it during the session. Sorry about that, guys.
Okay, you're allowed.
Great. Thank you, Katarina. Thank you.
So it's a great pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation from Simone. But so I did started out as a modeler working with Tassos, but in the meantime, I've done a lot of policy work. And so the question that was directed to me, this question that Simone has formulated, was very much an institutions, economic policy kind of question. So I decided to talk a little bit more about this aspect of potential Mediterranean water policies. So first thing I think is useful is to get an idea of what are we talking about exactly when we talk about transboundary water management. So luckily for us, the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations includes a specific Sustainable Development Goal indicator on transboundary cooperation, which means we have data for this aspect. So this is when we talk about transboundary water resources, here they are in this map. Okay, so you see in blue the transboundary river and lake basins, and you see in green the transboundary aquifers. So both of them are common resources, and both of them require particular attention from the involved countries. Now, it's pretty significant. The numbers are here. So 313 rivers, 468 aquifers shared by 2 or more countries, and a total of 153 countries in the world are involved in some way in transboundary water resources. So this is a very relevant issue worldwide. Okay, now if we look at the Mediterranean, already we can see that there's a difference between the north part of the Mediterranean and the south part of the Mediterranean in terms of what kinds of resources we're talking about. You can see very well that in the sort of European side of the Mediterranean, it's mostly blue. There's a little speck of green here and there, but it's mostly, when there are transboundary resources, it's mostly the rivers and lakes. Whereas in North Africa, in this part here in the Middle East, it's also a lot of aquifer management. Okay, so we do have a bit of a difference between what we're talking about when we talk about transboundary resources in the Mediterranean. Already the reality, the geographical reality of the beast we have to model and handle is quite different. In terms of the SDG indicator, so the UN asks every country to tell us how much of their water resources, so the transboundary water resources, are already being managed in an organized way, so with the other countries. And this is the value of the indicator 6.52, which measures progress on transboundary water cooperation. And you can see here, only 43 countries currently report that they have 90% or more of the transboundary waters covered by operational arrangements. So operational arrangements require you to have some sort of formal, official cooperation structure with regular reporting, monitoring, meeting, and so on and so forth. So this is the status quo. So 43 countries have this cooperation, and we have here Portugal and Spain as 100%. So that's 90% or more, but in the case of Portugal and Spain, it's actually 100%. So we report, Portugal and Spain report to the world that we are cooperating 100% of our shared resources. I'll tell you in a minute why I thought this context was important. So now I'm going to answer your question, Simone, but I did think it was important to, and of course, let me just point out that there is, again, a bit of a difference. This is now not a geographical difference anymore. This is an institutional difference between the north of the Mediterranean and the south. So we do have a lot more countries in the European Union reporting a very high level of transboundary water management than in the south. Now, let me answer your question after I give you this context. But before I do so, let me just show you this picture. This is a case of a transboundary water resource. And this is, I mean, if the yellow line wasn't there, you're looking at a landscape. We put these lines on these landscapes, but the line is effectively something that we made up. It's not there. There's no line. If you're a fish and you're going from one side or the other, there's nothing there. So the rivers, Portugal and Spain share rivers, but rivers, in fact, historically have been our boundary. They've been our border. So rivers divided us before they've united us, you know? It's a bit, the way we look at the borders between the two countries is not necessarily the way we should be looking at the shared resources that we have. So we put on this geographical united reality our divisions, right? Now, the question was, how can we try to make national water management align better with the regional transboundary cooperation goals? I would say most of us in this room are aware that water bodies should be managed according to their nature, their true geographical scale, which is the river basin or the aquifer, depending on whether we're talking about superficial water or surface water or groundwater, right? So we, in principle, no matter where we are in the Mediterranean, the scale that we should be using to manage is the geographical scale, the real scale of the water body. The main difference, I think, institutionally between the north of the Mediterranean and the south is that in the EU member states, we are mandated by the EU to draw up river basin management plans according to the Water Framework Directive. So explicitly in the Water Framework Directive, it tells us that we are it's binding. We have to report our rivers according to the river basin management perspective, and that explicitly includes international river basins. So EU countries have to get together to tell the Commission what they're doing for their shared river basins. Okay, so that is not happening, of course, in the south of the Mediterranean area. So all those they don't share a lot of river basins, as we saw. They're mostly sharing aquifers, but they're not mandated. You know, the UN recommends that all these resources be managed regionally, so with transboundary cooperation, but it's not mandatory. Whereas in the EU, it is mandatory, and that is probably the reason why Portugal and Spain appear with a nice 100%. We're doing this 100%. In the case of Portugal and Spain specifically, we actually have an instrument that covers our transboundary resources, which is called the Albufeira Convention. It was signed in 1998, so a couple of years before the Water Framework Directive was actually approved, and it included all 5 transboundary river basins in the Iberian Peninsula. I think, in my opinion, that the key aspect of this negotiation was that there are 5 of them. And so it was possible for the politicians at the time to kind of accept a few things for some river basins in exchange for things in other river basins. You know, it is important. It was important, I think, in the Portugal-Spain case, it was facilitating that we have different river basins where we could say, well, we accept this in this river basin, but on the other hand, we want that and that river basin. You know, it makes it a bit easier to do to have the agreement between the two countries, I think. So, what did we do in the convention? What does the convention actually do? So it states that there's a priority of planning for hydrological planning for the international river basins. But the technical aspect that is most important is that the convention establishes a minimum flow regime. So in this case, because we are downstream, almost all the 5 river basins were downstream from the Spanish side. So it establishes how much the Spanish have to put in the river to send to us. I mean, I still remember when I first started many, many years ago, listening to some Spanish people saying we should not let a drop of water be wasted to the sea or to Portugal. So that was the story in the 1980s, right? So there was this view that whatever resources weren't being used in the country were being wasted, whether that was to the sea or to Portugal. So the Albufeira Convention did change that in a sense, saying that no, that Portugal is here, the rivers are ours as well, so there's a minimum flow that you have to leave in the river for the downstream users. It is quite relevant. I don't know if you know that everyone knows the geographical reality of the Iberian Peninsula, but it's the international river basins cover 60% of Portugal and 40% of Spain. In terms of land. So it is quite significant. The area that these river basins cover is quite significant in our reality. A second important aspect, well, this is like a principle, but you know, flow regimes have been an important aspect of this cooperation, and the second important aspect was for the prevention and coordination of extreme events, namely flooding. So the fact that this convention was signed and this committee exists to dialogue between the two countries is extremely important, especially when an extreme event comes along. So, for example, if there's lots of rain in both countries and then they manage the dams together so that we can be sure that no flooding arises because one country made a decision. Normally Spain, because again, we're downstream, except for the Guadiana. In the Guadiana, we can affect the Spanish side as well. But for all the other rivers, it's basically the Spaniards making decisions and affecting the Portuguese. So we do have this in place, and it's very useful, I believe, when floods, potential floods can be avoided by better coordination of the two river sides. There's a lot of dams in these rivers, both on the Spanish and the Portuguese side, so the dams are managed when there are flooding potential events, the dams are managed jointly to make sure that to minimize the chance of destructive flooding. Of course, the governance and public participation is also stated as a priority of the Albufeira Convention, but I have to say we haven't seen a lot of that. Sorry. Although it's in the convention, but there's not a lot of public participation. In terms of governance, you know, there's the official meetings, they occur, but sometimes they don't occur. If nothing new is happening, they just kind of like don't speak. But at least there's the committee is there, and there's a chance for dialogue whenever it's necessary. Now, on how can national water management align more effectively? So you'd be thinking, because Portugal and Spain have been doing this for such a long time, probably the national water policies are very well aligned, right? So Renan's going to talk about the Spanish case, but for the Portuguese case, I'm not bearing good news today. So we just approved a new water strategy, which is called in Portuguese Água que une, that means water that unites. You would think, you know, water that unites with Spain, right? Because we share the resources. The whole thing is about integrating water flows inside the national borders of Portugal. And when I say integrating water flows, that means water transfers between basins, that means big infrastructure, dams, you know, construction, all those things that we've been saying for many, many years are not the way to go. But that's what we're doing. Ecological needs are stated to be 10% of the flow in the river. So as long as you leave 10% of the river flow in the water, then the ecological needs are satisfied. I mean, do these people know what a river is? if the river's flowing at 100% and you take out 90% of the water, it's not the same river. It's not the same ecosystem. So in terms of what we are putting out to the world in policy terms, I'm just sad to show you this, but this is where we are now. Consumption in Portugal is expected by this document to increase 26% by 2040, although because of climate change, they expect precipitation, so water availability to drop by 6%. So the starting point is availability is going to drop by 6%, but we have so much water, because we only need 10% of that in the river, we can still do a lot more in terms of increasing consumption. 85% of this increased consumption is planned to come from new and improved infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I mean cement, okay? I mean real infrastructure, great infrastructure. Finally, I looked for the word Spain in the document. So Spain is mentioned only once in the Portuguese new Portuguese water strategy, and it's mentioned once in the context of the Tejo River Basin. I'm sorry, the sentence is in Portuguese, but I'll translate. So the water security of the region faces challenges because we are dependent on the water that comes from Spain. That's the only time that Spain is mentioned. It's to say Spain is a threat because, they can take our water away. So this is not a good, I'm sorry, this is what I had to say about how national water strategies could potentially align when the institutions are in place, and this could be done in a different way, but this is what we're doing in 2025. So I don't have an answer to your question, Simone. We could do better, but it's...
I'm afraid.
Yes.
You did answer. Probably it was not what I was expecting or what I...
Sorry,
but
I wished for better news.
yeah,
but
exactly. We have to be real, and that's the reality, which I ignore. But this shows that there is a lot of work to be done for MEDAERE, I think, no? That's the good aspect, if you want to see one. Okay, thank you, Katarina. From one Katarina to the other, from one Mediterranean region to a northern region, because we want to learn also from other contexts. So I invite now Katarina Elofsson, who is professor of environmental economics at Aarhus University and professor in economics at Södertörn University. I hope it's kind of okay. Her research focuses on land use, biodiversity, and water quality using bioeconomic models, informed decision at the EU national and local level through interdisciplinary collaborations with scientists and stakeholders. Among the many things I could mention in her CV, she's a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry, and has advised Danish and Swedish agencies on marine conservation, biodiversity offsetting, and carbon sequestration. So, Katarina with K, my question to you is, how can cost-effective water quality policies be applied in transboundary settings with unequal capacities and divergent incentives?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm happy to be here with you to discuss the transboundary water management. And I have not worked on the Mediterranean, but I have worked on topics related to the Baltic Sea for like almost 30 years by now. And I want to talk about that today. So first we have this question on cost effectiveness. So I think we can look a little bit into the research that has been done on the Baltic. I first want to present to you a little bit about the environmental context and the institutional context, and then we can look at what have environmental economists done. And doing that, I will talk about studies that have been done, mostly applied to multiple countries across the Baltic Sea. There are also very many studies applied at national level. I will talk less about those. So what I will talk about is eutrophication. So that is over-enrichment of water bodies. That is a worldwide problem appearing in the world's coastal waters, also in inland waters. And it's, what you can see then is that you have large growth of plankton algae, and you get hypoxia, so a lack of oxygen in the water and in the bottom sediments, and the water gets turbid. And the ultimate cause of this is loads of nutrients. And these can originate from land-based sources, but also from atmospheric deposition. And the emissions that are of interest here, that is nitrogen and phosphorus. So to the right here, we can see a map, a recent map from 2023 on the Baltic Sea that is displaying the nitrogen and phosphorus inputs. In each pair, the nitrogen is to the left and the phosphorus is to the right. And there are inputs to different sub-basins of the Baltic Sea compared to the maximum allowable input. So you can see several of them are green, which means that it looks pretty good. Some are red, and most important is that the central basin of the Baltic Sea, the Baltic proper basin, which is the largest one and directly receives emissions from all the coastal countries, there the targets are not met, and the conditions are also problematic from a eutrophication point of view. Also, if you have good eyesight, you can see there are also problems in the Gulf of Finland, which is a gulf that is right south of Finland, and at the very end of that, you find St. Petersburg in Russia. So what about this region? There are in total 14 countries within the Baltic Sea catchment. Only 9 of those have a coastline along the sea, and for those that haven't, it's only Belarus that is of any importance when it comes to nutrient emissions, because there is this river Nima that flows from Belarus out to the Baltic Sea. Out of the 9 countries that have a coastline, 8 are members of the EU. So 4 old members and 4 new members. And the coastal countries differ quite substantially in GDP per capita. Russia, the non-EU member, it's about 12,000 euro per year, while the EU countries spend between 19,000 and 60,000 something. So it's quite big income differences and differences in the ability to pay. The countries also differ in their share of the coastline, from only 3% of the coastline for Lithuania to 30% for Sweden. That means that their stake in the water quality of the Baltic Sea differs quite a lot too. The population density varies. Poland is very densely populated, and also many people live far away from the coast, therefore seeing the Baltic Sea more seldom, and maybe not being equally concerned about that. And then we have also high population densities in mid-Sweden and South Sweden and in South Finland. What about the sea itself? Well, it's a shallow sea and therefore sensitive to pollution. There are basins separated by sills, implying that the environmental conditions differ quite a lot between these basins. In particular, the so-called limiting nutrient differs between the basins. So for some it can be nitrogen, for some it's phosphorus, and it can also be a bit variable across time and across base within a particular basin. In particular, there is now agreement that phosphorus is the limiting nutrient for the central basin, Baltic proper, that receives the loads from all the countries. The eutrophication symptoms vary across years. So one factor here is temperature, because if the highest temperature, it's more algae blooms. The other factors is saltwater inbreaks from Kattegat and the North Sea, which provides more oxygen-rich water. When we think about this problem of nutrient load reductions to the coast, we should also remember that there are co-benefits. One very important one is the upstream water quality in the inland waters. The other is fisheries dependent on nutrient concentrations, and there is an interaction there. So if we talk about cost-effective water quality policies, we need targets. There are targets. In 1974, the Baltic Sea Convention was instituted and signed, and there was a governing body, HELCOM, set up. Through HELCOM, there were ministerial declarations, which were an agreement in 1988 and 1990, saying that the loads of both nutrients should be reduced by 50% until 1995. That was never achieved. In 2007, that was replaced by new targets through the Baltic Sea Action Program, and these targets were now differentiated on the basin and country level. So it was specified how much was each country permitted to emit to each basin. And that built on marine modeling, but there was no explicit consideration of costs or fairness in these targets, and the similar still applies. Yet these new targets had a larger focus on phosphorus reductions than before, as there was new scientific evidence on the relative importance of the nutrients. Okay, first about the most obvious and general lessons from research. So if we have, instead of this Baltic Sea Action Program, had cost-effective Baltic-wide policies, the total costs of meeting the targets could be reduced by about 16%, or 1 billion euro per year, which is substantial money for the region. And it's also quite clear that the phosphorus reductions, they are more expensive than nitrogen reductions, shown by several studies. And then when we think about that, we can know that there is a larger potential for phosphorus reductions in countries with less advanced wastewater treatment, because a relatively large share of the phosphorus emissions come from wastewater treatment rather than from agriculture. Agriculture dominates for nitrogen. Also, there are lower mitigation costs in the new EU member states related to lower salaries, for instance, etc. And there are also large loads from Poland, implying that if we want to have cost effectiveness, much of the cost for these abatement will occur in Poland, which is the country with one of the largest incomes in the region. So that is a problem. There are more studies saying that if we want cost effectiveness, we should coordinate the management of nitrogen and phosphorus policies. And this is because many measures affect both. The other is that, okay, peaks in loads can be a problem. That can partly be solved by a portfolio approach, where you focus on countries that have simultaneously large loads. And this happens because you have a meteorological separation between the east and the south of the region. There are time lags in sea response to nutrient load reductions. That implies that if we have targets for coastal loads that are to be met at a certain point in time, the effect of that will appear in the sea after a very long time, in particular for phosphorus. This is because phosphorus is built up in the bottom sediment. So if you reduce the concentration in the sea, there will be phosphorus released from the bottoms. So that takes quite a long time, and that implies that any kind of attempt to do cost-effectiveness analysis, considering the time frame, will be very sensitive to assumptions about these time lags. Upstream impacts on inland waters that will occur together with changes in coastal loads, they are likely very, very important for the cost-effective solution, but also very little researched. There is a Danish study in progress studying upstream phosphorus reduction and coastal nitrogen reductions together, which will be an interesting application there. New eco-engineering methods that have been suggested and explored. Mussel cultivation, that could be cost-effective. They are filtering nutrients. Gypsum applications on agricultural fields to bind phosphorus, that same holds for that. It's suggested that artificial oxygenation of the Baltic Sea deeps could be useful, but that at least experiments should be carried out. And then we have the coastal fishery management. It suggested that it could be that explicit management of fishery could work as a tool to improve the water quality through trophic cascades. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Much to learn from the Baltic experience, even in terms of cooperation. I move to the last speaker, Renan-Ulrich. Renan is president of the Spanish-Portuguese Association and professor of economics at the University of Girona. He has a PhD from ETH in Zurich and postdoc at Berkeley University. His work bridges agricultural and environmental economics with mathematical modeling, focusing particularly on land, forest, and water management. Many publications which I will not cite, but is co-editor of Water Economics and Policy and the Natural Resource Management and Policy book series. So the right person to tell us the Spanish side now of the story.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a challenge, because usually I'm working more on modeling. So since you told me, I can freely interpret a little bit the question. I took the liberty to focus more on policy. So let's say we have followed the advice of Tassos. We have a nice model, and we go to the ministry and say, the ministry will say, fantastic, we try to implement this model. So everyone agrees, but the question is whether this will work. So what I will do in the next slides is to go to look at the situation in Spain, the water situation, the institutional framework, and look at the particular showcase, which showcase means the problem of Donana, which is this particular area, and try to analyze why did it fail. So, as I mentioned, I will be a little bit more free, and I look at more in the integrated water resource management, try to integrate all stakeholders, all measures, and not only transboundary problems. So we can have transboundary issues, but we also have other issues like the extraction itself, the sharing of rivers, the sharing of aquifers, and other measures. Okay. So in Spain, what is the situation? We have 25 years ago, there were 40 million people, and now there are about 50 million people. So it's quite an increase of 25%, and they are located more or less around the sea. So they like to take bath. So inside, apart from Madrid, there are not so many people. Then we look at the river basins. There are over 14 river basins. The Douro, Tajo, Guadiana are shared with Portugal.
And the Minho and the Lima.
And also this, yes. So this is a little bit minor.
Smaller.
Okay, so this is the situation. And then we have also cuencas internas. So they are not river basins, but they are autonomous region, and they manage their own water resources. So Andalusia and Catalonia. So what do these river basins do? They manage basically the river reservoirs and the groundwater. So if we look at the reservoirs, we can see where the reservoirs are. So here the Tajo and Duero, they are big reservoirs. Here in Catalonia, there are hardly any reservoirs. This way, we see this will be a big problem. Here are many people, a lot of irrigation, but little reservoirs. So the groundwater is more evenly distributed. Here's the area, agriculture area, so I will talk about agriculture in particular. But there's no many groundwater, but they have the Ebro River, and here in this area also not a lot of groundwater. So the green area is the irrigated area. So we see around the coast where the people live, but also later there we have irrigated. Around the rivers we have irrigated areas. So the irrigation, what happened to the irrigation to the last years? The area irrigated has increased a lot, which does not mean it's a bad thing, because actually what happened is the type of irrigation has changed. The overall use of irrigation, the overall use of water of irrigation is more or less stable in time. What has decreased is the gravity. So there's still a lot of room for reducing gravity, but there are certain areas where you don't want to get rid of gravity. So this is the area where in the delta, because if you don't apply gravity, if you use sprinkler irrigation, then you have saltwater intrusion. So you want to have at least some sort of gravity. So what happened? What did the farmer do? The extended area. Here we see they extended the area of irrigation and used it basically for specific crops. Which crops? Tree crops. Because they are very critical. With the climate change, we have droughts. The droughts means here we have more severe droughts, more frequent ones. In the worst thing, they last longer. And this lasts longer is a very critical issue, because if they last for 2 years, your trees are dead. If you only cultivate a crop, you renounce for 1 year and that's it. Next year maybe you can grow again. But if you lose your trees, then you have to wait another 10 years until the trees are again effective. So and then, because of beside the groundwater and the surface water, we have transboundary. Basically, it's a transponder between different regions, between different river basins. But overall, they are not so important. In the future, in contrast to what Katarina told us, there are no planes. There was a plan about 20 years to make big transfers, but it was abolished. Because you can see it involves a lot of cost, because very costly infrastructure. Okay, so if we look at the overall situation of Spain, then we can say 80% goes to the agriculture, 15% goes to the domestic users, and 5% goes to the industry. So overall, we're good. This is 24 when there was a drought. Overall, that's good. But it doesn't mean that it's good everywhere, because there are many local differences. And here we have the general idea of the situation in Spain. And this map shows you precipitation minus evaporation. So everywhere where it is not blue, it means we are negative. The evaporation is higher than the precipitation. When you have the green area, it doesn't mean that it's very nice. It simply means that the irrigated areas. And then you see the transboundary is actually where you have an irrigated area, mostly. The blue line is here, which means we have desalination. This is now planned for Spain as well, because you see there are some irrigated areas, but overall Catalonia hasn't got very big reservoirs. Okay, so what is the future of the hydrological situation in Spain? If we look at the past, okay, this is 95 to 2015. It has decreased 2% per Catalonia. We say, it's not so bad, 2%, we can live with it. No? Now, with 2015 to 25, it has gone a little bit worse, but I don't have the right numbers right now. But if we look at the last year, so where I live, there's a little reservoir, it's called Sau. And we look from 89 to 2025, sometimes we have a drought, but the strongest drought was recently, the last 3 years. So this is the critical aspect, that the droughts last longer. Unfortunately, this is the red line here, is the blue, is the current year. We were very bad, but it has increased a lot. So this is the reservoir in January. Usually everything is covered with water. They flooded this area. It looks like there was a village before. This is the reservoir as a whole in January. And this is the reservoir today. You can see still the tower of the church. So, but as we say, the drought is over. It means it's one day less to the next drought. It's good to see. We had a drought. People were accustomed. I was taking a shower. We always had a bucket. We tried to recover the water. No? We were not allowed to use a lot of water for irrigation of the garden was forbidden unless it was for trees. Okay, so, but even if now we say, oh, it's fantastic, we have a very nice situation, but still here in this area, there is a lot of, there's not enough water. The situation in the embalses on the reservoirs is still very low. Even in Valencia, where they have a strong inundation, they only have 60%. So if we look at the legal framework and the institution, there's the Water Framework Directive. And then the Water Framework Directive is transformed into national laws, and the water is the public domain, belongs to everyone. So everything is governed by the central government. The central government then decides how to operate them. And the operation is done by the river basins. So this is what the river basins do. But then we have another problem here. This is the Rio Tajo. This is the Spanish part. If we look at it, we see there are already 4 different communities. 4 different communities. They have different political color, different objectives, and often they do not coincide what to do. So this is another problem with the implementation, because we have multi-level government structures. The local government, okay, this is usually not so important. It's important for domestic users, because the local government decides the price for the domestic users. Well, not the government itself, but they have institutions who decide. That's why you pay, I don't know, but 3 times more in Malaga for water than in Girona. So, looking at what the river basins did with the money, we can see the money they spent basically was on infrastructure and very little money to government improvement. So they spend the money more on the supply side, maybe it's more also on the demand side, but not for improving the coordination between the different governments, because we have seen the multi-level government structure. Now, often we have the case of user conflicts, agriculture, environment, fishery, tourist industry, and urbanistic pressure, position urbanistica, yeah, or urban pressure, okay, urban pressure. So I will look at two cases. Basically, I will look at the National Park Donana, which is a World Heritage since '94, and the Biosphere Reserve since the '80s. Another issue is the Mar Menor Laguna La Salada, una laguna salada. The Mar Menor is this area, which is here in Spain, so it's a little bit south of Valencia. And if we look what happened, these are first cycle. So Catarina told the river basins management have to do a report every 6 years. Now we are running 22 to 27. So if we look at the current cycle, so the situation has gone worse. Because the river basin they have to report what is, but they also have to plan how to improve. So, but they did not improve. So they planned to improve, but did not improve. So it's obvious there's an enforcement and control problem. This is what I see as the biggest problem, because we have supranational institutions like the Water Framework Directive, we have the national, but the actual work is done at the lower level. And the lower level may follow the rules or not. The higher level cannot enforce them. Or the lower levels play on time, say, well, we wait for a little bit, and since the ministry doesn't come down here and look, we can just go on. So the Doñana is a biosphere, which is this green area here. It's south of Sevilla. And if we look at the status here, we have extraction in the status, ecological status. It was also, instead of improving over the years, it has deteriorated. And the over-extraction is very high. So the Junta de Andalucía decided we make a plan. This was about 11 years ago. We want to improve. And they implemented, they thought about many measures, but 23% were not implemented at all. 54 were partially implemented. And after, so as we have seen the last 10 years, there was no improvement. So even though there were some of them implemented, it did not succeed to improve. So there was a community pressure by the EU, which wanted to sanction the Spanish government. Actually, Spain was condemned. There was for abusive withdrawal. And also, some supermarkets in Germany wanted to make a boycott. So don't buy the strawberries from this region, because Donana, the aquifer, the nearby area, use a lot of the water for the irrigation of the strawberries. So, because in this time frame, there was a lot of pressure from supermarkets, but also from the Worldwide Fund. And the pressure was, maybe we have to withdraw, we have to take the Donana from the list of bioreservoirs and World Heritage. So they signed an agreement because they wanted to reduce the extraction, which basically means to shut down the illegal wells, because there are many illegal wells, or illegal wells were used to expand the area of irrigation. So the idea was carrot and sticks. Carrots means money. Okay, we have here money. And the thing was, okay, whether it's legal or illegal, we don't care. We give you money anyhow, as long as you do something. And the fines, okay, but we also have fines. So if if you detect that there's illegal well, we fine you. But the thing is, it didn't work because maybe detection, the government was not really behind it. The detection was very low, and even if it was detected and they were supposed to pay a fine, they did not fine, then they was taken to the court system, and the court system takes ages. So meanwhile, you can extract the water. So I think if we want to improve the implementation, one can think about cross-compliance. We know cross-compliance from agricultural measures. The farmer gets some money if we use some additional action, take some additional action like minimum tillage or crop rotation with legumes. So in this sense, I think it may be interesting to look at ideas whether you can have cross-compliance, not only for the farmers, but also for institutions. Because they get money from Europe or from the central government, but you can link it to something else, regional development funds or whatever. But there must be some sort of level that you can touch the nerve. So this might be an idea we can think about how implementation can be more effective. Okay, so the lessons is basically what I explained more in general is we have to take care of, if we think about measurements, implementation of policies, we have to take into account all stakeholders, and we have to respect multi-level government structures, so not only the local, but also the higher level government structures. And if the solution cannot be imposed, which is often the case, cannot be imposed, the solution must generate cooperative benefit, which means benefits that only arise if we cooperate. And the final lesson is to think about the compliance of other activities than the activity you want to implement. Okay, I think this is what I wanted to say here.
Thanks a lot. The lessons are a good summary of what you were explaining on the way. Due to time constraints, I will skip the second round of questions I had because I would rather open the floor to questions from the audience. And so I invite you to raise your hand.
So thank you very much. I think it is interesting and this is a very timely topic of major importance. And I would like just to mention two aspects that you didn't mention explicitly, but of course it can be considered in what we use, but I think that it should be explicitly each student at the level on that. And I think that would be also interesting to take into account, which is the use of water for energy purposes. It also has a huge implication, and because of the timing. And this depends more on, the market, the price of the market. Sorry. Okay, but I think I'll help. Yeah, okay.
But
so,
go ahead.
It's
he could
more,
hear.
So so I'm talking about the fact that water is also used for energy purposes, and this is quite relevant in Portugal, but also I believe that in Spain. And in fact, this means that there are two issues that should be raised in this context, namely the fact that often we have the power plants that have to be, they have to refrigerate so they have to use the water in the rivers in order to decrease the temperature of their engines or wherever, and therefore this also, when the flow is very low, has a huge implication because it decreases significantly the temperature in the water, in the river, and has huge negative impacts on biodiversity. She has also studied that. She did it for some river basins that are shared between Portugal and Spain. This student of mine, and besides that, this is the fact that the time of energy is completely different from other timing. And this should be taken into account because, in fact, there are a lot of strategic behavior from the energy system, depending on, and this happened in Portugal, in fact, recently, and she also studied that, and it's really very important not to forget about it. So I think this is in MEDAERE, she studied for MEDAERE, the joint market of energy between Portugal and Spain, and I think this could be also something that should be mentioned in this context, because nowadays it's really very, very important, because often there is a large opportunity cost of not using the water by the dams, and for energy purposes, and this also is a different timing from any other and should be accounted for. So that's what I would like just to mention, but I think this is super interesting and I really enjoyed all the presentations, so it's great. Thank you very much for organizing this session.
Thank you, Maria. I think Aldo was raising his hand.
2 points. Thank you very much for very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. This is a session proposed by MEDAERE, so I have in my head Mediterranean and even the convention of is it OSPAR convention, or anyway on the Baltic Sea is very useful for Mediterraneans, which are not so rational as our northern European friends. We have around, I'm afraid, an overestimation of the importance of participation, sort of mythology. This is typical of the environmental community. It's very important to be participatory, inclusive, and so on. But let's not forget that when we have situations of privilege, not to speak of illegality, it's a good idea to bring back polluter pays principle, responsibility, accountability in behavior. So I'm thinking to the Doñana Fresas developers using water sometimes in not a fair way. We have in Italy lots of them. We are in good competition and good company, and the south of Mediterranean as well. So that was my first point. The second is when we analyze as economists dealing with environment and climate, let's keep in mind the institutional aspect. I have a bias on policies, I declare it. We have, I think, a very good approach which has been proposed by the European Commission together with all of us, the members of the European Union, which is the optimal water basin approach. And this might help us also in analyzing and suggesting policy solutions in the south of Mediterranean. We have not done all our work in the north part of Mediterranean, but in the south also. From this point of view, I bring a little stone in the debate, which is the work of Plan Bleu for Development and Environment in Mediterranean, which came out with an update on Mediterranean Sustainable Development Strategy and a number of works also on water. They be taken into consideration when we work on these things.
Thank you, Aldo, for reminding us also about the importance of pricing, which was one of the questions I had prepared, but now.
I just have a technical, because I'm not so familiar with the problem. I was thinking about the case of Doña Ana that you were explaining. Can you give us an intuition or your sense of why do you observe that the plan was not, there was no compliance? You said that 23%.
Well, it's basically you make a plan with a lot of measures, but maybe your intention is not to implement everything. The intention is to satisfy the higher authority.
There are some lobby in place then that you think?
Of course. Then in the banana is another party than in the central government, so there are always fights. Because one party is in the region and the other one is in the central government. They always try to defend the people local because they are farmers, so they have basically a lot of votes. They bring a lot of votes.
Have you observed any kind of more non-compliance when they are close to elections? Is there any evidence that that's happening? Or?
No, I mean, because they extended the area, the cultivation area, by illegal wells.
Okay, so then it's illegal.
Or incluso, they had a legal well, but then they changed the crop to more beneficial crops, which require more water. So they say it's a lack of control. And maybe there's, from the local government, there's no sufficient interest to enforce it.
And probably locals anticipate that they don't have any interest
Yes.
in doing that, and they just
But even if they get fined, then the legal system is very slow. It also means that they play on this because the fine is probably very low. Because if you know in 3 years I get 100,000, a fine of 100,000, then you don't play on time. You only play on time if you weigh up. I can wait. I can make 50,000 in 3 years, and the fine is 500. So.
thank you.
I take a question from Ruslana, who is connected online. By the way, Ruslana, very happy to see you. Sorry that you are not here with us, but it's great that you are in the session with us. Go ahead.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you all the panelists for the rich and insightful overviews that you provided. I also wanted to add a few perspectives from the Israel point that may resonate with some of the challenges and transitions we are all facing in the Mediterranean. First, transboundary water issues are very real for us. Israel shares key water sources with the neighbors, with Jordan and in the east, and Lebanon in the north, etc. And also, of course, Palestinian Authority, where we share the mountain aquifer system. And water scarcity is a natural condition in our region for a long time. And the prevailing approach was highly protective, similar to what Katarina, I think I mentioned about Portugal and Spain. And there it was decades ago, and here it is even now, was it not giving up even a single drop of water. But this mindset actually is beginning to shift thanks to the large-scale desalination projects that are already installed in Israel and basically changed the game significantly. For example, under the peace agreement with Jordan, Israel already supplies natural water to 50 million cubic meters per year. So we do think the technological progress that also can help us with thanks to innovation and to deal with the water scarcity. And we have published a paper about desalination and treated wastewater and the contribution of those technologies not only to peace but also to tackle climate change. And another dimension I wanted to mention, also connected to what was discussed before about gentrification. We have in the south the Red Sea that also faces serious threats from nitrogen runoff and already caused notable damage to coral reefs. As a result, the Israeli government imposed strict caps on nitrogen discharge into the Red Sea. Interestingly, this entire allowance is now consumed by desalination plants that are installed there. And this means that no increase in any new economic activity can be done in this region without full elimination of nitrogen waste before it can be approved. So in another study that we conduct now with David Zilberman, we analyze some type of circular economy where onshore fishery can be combined with algae that can potentially treat the wastewater from nitrogen, and then this water can be used to irrigate high-value crops like dates. So we collaborate with engineers to see whether this cycle is possible and what is the economic value of allowances and the caps in this setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslana, for bringing the experience from Israel and from this world Mediterranean region. We are comparing experiences, and somehow this is exactly what MEDAERE wants to do. Another question
answer
here?
questions first? I mean, there were so many now. I'm happy to ask, but...
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay. Karen Pittel, IFO Institute in Munich, and I'm interested in the role of financing. I mean, there's at least, we were writing a report on water globally, and there was always the discussion about the role that private finance and public finance should play, leveraging private finance, the fear of actually then special interests, etc., getting too much track. So I would be curious what any of you, what your take on that is. And on the other hand, with respect to the water resilience strategy that the EU is now basically starting and potentially new funding as well, is that really what's needed, or is really an overhaul of the governance structures? I mean, that's what I got from the last presentation, much more necessary than additional funding. Thank you.
The funding, if the infrastructure, for instance, in north of Spain, when they wanted to have irrigation channels, it's basically paid by the state. Farmers have to pay some part, but they pay as they go. So farmers have to pay a part that the state finances it, and farmers have to pay, but as they go. This is one example. And maybe we have to look at other examples. It doesn't mean that it always has to be like this. No? But this is I'm talking about a water irrigation area.
Well, what's happened in Portugal is the state moves on with the financing first, and then private financing does, for example, the plots, irrigation structures or things like that. But the state moves ahead first with the big investments in infrastructure. And apparently in Portugal, this is what they're thinking of doing. I did look at the water resilience strategy, and the current Portuguese national water strategy is completely misaligned with the water resilience strategy. The water resilience strategy is all about nature-based solutions, about free-flowing rivers, and we're still talking about building new infrastructure to store water. I mean, we don't talk about water storage in the soil, which the water resilience strategy talks about. We don't talk about what other measures I saw. Demand management, better demand management is not in the Portuguese national water strategy. So I think there's still some misalignment. Well, the Portuguese water strategy, at the end they say we will also be looking out for the new water resilience strategy, which had not been published at the time. But now it's been published, and it's completely different from what the Portuguese strategy is doing. So I'm hoping that through EU financing shifts, this might also help us change the focus of the national water policy, because the EU financing is still a big part of some of these projects. So if the EU says we will not finance your new dam, but we will finance, soils, water storage, organic carbon in the soil, whatever, then that might shift a bit what the national, even the private investors might want to do. I had some ideas to talk about pricing because, Simone did ask about that. And pricing as a tool, it's, as we all know, extremely useful and extremely powerful, but in terms of transboundary water management, I don't think it's the best tool. Why? Because the the pricing tools that are available to governments are basically national tools. So the Portuguese government can't charge the Spanish farmer for whatever, so we can try to use pricing tools, and we do have a water resource tax in Portugal, for example, for different items, but it's very difficult to use tax or charge type instruments in a transboundary context, even within the EU, even with countries that already have a convention that have been working together for 25 plus years, it's difficult. But I do think that the nexus sort of perspective of bringing in the other stakeholders, such as the energy sector, such as the food production sector, and discussing how can we do better for all, how can we find the win-win situations and steer clear of the trade-offs, where we're harming the energy aspect is harming the ecosystem, or the food aspect is harming the water availability or whatever. If we manage to bring that nexus perspective into the institutions, I think that might be more helpful than just simple pricing instruments. Although I do believe in pricing instruments, for sure, but I don't think they're specially adapted to transboundary situations. That's my view. And I do think EU funding is a big part of the pressure that the EU can put on. I don't know about the strawberry farmers in Doñana, but we have a lot of farming that is reliant on EU subsidies, namely the CAP policy. If they tie it with, if you have an illegal well or whatever, you're not getting any money from the EU, then that might make people change more than the fine of the Spanish government or the region, So I think if we pay a bit more attention to the link between the overall agricultural policy funding and the type of research management practices, maybe we can get better results. Hopefully, I don't know.
The money, if you have a river basin, then if you get assigned water, you pay a fixed charge, and this fixed charge is also differentiated to the crop. And so, depends very much on the river basin, but you have to look in detail which river basin you're talking about. But a big amount is actually fixed charge, and then another part is the variable part.
Yeah, I agree a lot with you that the enforcement and the financing are important, and I think they are quite much linked together. We did a cross-country comparison for the Baltic Sea, where we, somewhat to my surprise, found that measures that were supported with agri-environmental support from the EU had a higher level of implementation than measures that were strictly regulated. I think the explanation is rather simple, because for the regulated measures, it is the local government that are responsible for the enforcement, and they don't have the capacity or the real incentives for complete enforcement. While for the EU agri-environmental support, I have always been thinking that the sanctions are very weak, because what typically happens is that you have to pay the subsidy back that you got, but you don't get any fine. But similarly, the effect is still strong enough. It could be economic effect, it could be the fact that it could be a reputation effect, because farmers cannot move away. Then I've also seen, as you mentioned, Ruslana, with examples with trying to offset the nutrient emissions, that local government can sometimes have initiative in this regards with offsetting measures like mussel cultivations that will filter the nutrients along the coast. Well, there has been a big difference there. There are quite many of these attempts that have failed. Money has been paid out, funding has been paid out for setting up these mussel farms, but then the entrepreneurs have simply disappeared with the gear that they got for free and sold it off elsewhere. And a clear difference here is that they are not attached to that particular point like a landowner is. Yeah.
And so there is no reputation effect in that
No,
case.
yeah, well.
Because they're gone.
Yeah, they can
So
change name.
I was
or
wondering why
something.
you were talking whether the reputation effect would be different in different world areas. I mean, whether the Mediterranean would be similar to
no.
the Baltic or no, I'm not sure. That's a research question, I would say. There is an intervention by Tassos, and then one here.
Yes, thank you. Well, following Karen's point about finance, I think there are two issues here. The first has to do with the exposure of the financial system to agricultural mainly activities which are very sensitive to water availability. So if the footprint of the financial system is very high, and there is sort of, we have these things that I described earlier in the form of catastrophic events or severe droughts, then this might create instability in the financial system because of the exposure of the banks and the inability of individual farmers or industrial farmers to repay debt. So there's one issue that relates strongly to the relationship now between the financial system and the environmental system that sometimes we overlook when we try to do our analysis. I mean, it's not just the real economy, it's the financial system that feeds back to the real economy through these different exposures. The second, regarding private financing, I think that one has to start looking more seriously to green bond types of instruments in the way that the issue of green bonds could be incentivized through the EU taxonomy and through other possible incentives that might try to reduce the private sector to finance infrastructures or to finance payments for ecosystem services that relate to the preservation of the watershed. So this type, because I don't think that the amount of money, especially when we talk about the adaptation to climate change and the different resources that are required in order to defend against climate change, is so big that I think that it's not possible to have everything made out of the state. So the private sector should be mobilized in order to support some finance. And the final point regarding to the instruments, I agree. I think it was Katarina talking about the inability or the not, or having a pricing instrument not being appropriate for transboundary pollution problems. I agree. I think quota systems should be more appropriate, and especially if you make the quota systems tradable, then in this case one might be able to transfer resources to regions which are relatively poor by allocating some more quotas which will be able to be traded among regions. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tassos. This also answered one of the questions I had in mind somehow. Exactly. There is one question more.
Hi, it's more a comment than a question. I work on water management in the Mediterranean in France. And when I listen to Katarina or to Renan, then I say I just wanted to say it reminds me so much what I see in the Mediterranean in France. So I agree. Before talking about transboundary management, there's a huge monitoring problem. It's really huge. I think this is the first problem that we all have in the Mediterranean water management, maybe except in Israel. I don't know if it's different, but it's my vision of it. So I think it's a real big problem. And then there was a big drought in the last 3 years in the south of France as well. And I agree with Katarina. Unfortunately, although there are
the Water Framework Directive. There are so many tools out there that are really sophisticated and nice. But the first reaction of the national government was, okay, we will put millions here in this area to make a water resilience plan, and the water resilience plan is a little bit of treatment of wastewater, and 80% of new infrastructure building. So that's the first reaction to a really big problem. So unfortunately, even at the national level, we are not yet at finding sophisticated financial bonds or things like that. We are quite far from good monitoring and environmentally friendly water management. So I think we can.
I have to make a point about wastewater, if I may, Simone.
Yes, please.
Because in the Portuguese case, although wastewater reuse is super important EU-wide, and it's one of the issues that's mentioned in the water resilience strategy, and everyone agrees that improving the reuse of treated water is essential. In Portugal, it's not going to be that useful. Why? Because the cities, if you look at the Portuguese distribution of population, all the population is in the coast, which means they're at downstream, at the end of the river. So there's no potential of bringing that water back, because you're not going to pump that water hundreds of kilometers inland for farmers to reuse. So reuse is very useful, and we can use it to do things like city gardens and things like that, but it's always going to be, in Portugal, a very small contribution to the water resilience strategy because of the location of our Portuguese cities. It's not feasible to transport the water to where it's needed in huge quantities.
Any other question? Three minutes.
I mean, if there's no other question, my feeling is always that it kind of goes along, I'm not sure who said it, that the emphasis is so much more on the supply. I mean, it's hardly on the demand. And we're always discussing that efficiency increases, etc., could help alleviate the problems, but I honestly don't have any idea of how much it can make a difference. So if any of you have any information on that, that would be great. I mean, is demand management really a powerful tool, or is it just something that I would imagine?
Anybody with an answer on this?
I mean, if you say 80% of the water is for agriculture, and then if you take a crop, let's say maize, they have 6,000 cubic meters, and if you take another crop, which has 2,000, so it probably means you have to touch upon the type of crops they can grow. And also the price, I mean, in Zaragoza, it's very, very low. So there is no signaling for the price, and the people can grow what they want. In other areas, the price is much higher. So obviously, I think there's room. One has to decide how much it would change. And so this is a very localized study, but I think there's room.
Well, there's a very nice paper in Read, you might have read it, by Carlos Perez Blanco, and Arthur Essenfeldt, who was here yesterday. And they analyzed a whole bunch of efficiency improvements for agriculture specifically. So again, in our context, agriculture is the main user in quantitative terms. And when you talk about efficiency in agriculture, everyone is for, let's do that. Let's use less water and bring out as much value in our crops as possible. But what tends to happen is that there's a rebound effect, and practically all of the gains that are coming from the irrigation improvements are then used, as Renan showed. The water consumption in Spanish agriculture remains stable, although there was a significant shift from less efficient to more efficient irrigation systems. Because what they do, and the same thing happened in Portugal, what they do is essentially they use the water, quote-unquote, savings to increase the irrigated land, the size of the irrigated land. So there is not that much to be gained from there. Now, the paper does say if the efficiency in technology is complemented by higher prices, then you could have a true water-saving effect. But that is very, very uncommon. So we're still believers in prices, yeah? We still believe that if prices were higher, this would make a difference. And I mean, we can see differences even though we think our prices are low, if you compare the EU to China, our water prices are much higher, and we are much more efficient at using the water here than, in other regions of the world. So, and I'm sure in Israel it's also the case. The water price is much higher, and we do see better improvements in the management of the resource. But there's only so much you can do with pricing because demand tends to be very inelastic. So.
I mean, in Germany, in many sectors, or in America, we don't have any prices, so that's not helping.
Not only in Germany, I mean, yes. Okay, I think time's up. No, time is gone because we're 1 minute late. So it's time to close. But before closing, I really want to thank all the speakers, all the participants. I think I conclude with one word. I like the expression agua que une, right? There seems to be a long way still to go to unify our countries and our also national regulations on this. The only aqua que une for the moment is the rain. But it's okay. Thank you all.